Today I want to talk about development in Indonesia that has probably been around for the last 10, 15 years, but many people do not either know about it, or if they do, they very often seem to misunderstand what's actually happening on the ground. And so I came across this when I did research in Indonesia on another topic. And then as I started to look into this, became fascinated by the various kind of forces that actually are maybe driving this process in Indonesia. And of course, there's many developments we see in Indonesia that we could then also use to probably better understand societies like the one in the United States, or probably conservative movements here in Europe as well. And so what I want to talk today about with regard to Indonesia is how a country that has a unique reputation, probably also because it occupies a unique position in the Islamic world, has over the last couple of years probably changed in the public perception. And so if we look at how Indonesia has been perceived for a long time, it's been known as a country where we have a huge Muslim population. There's more Muslim people living in Indonesia than in the entire Middle East combined. But we never really talk or think about Indonesia when we talk about Muslim politics or politics in Islamic countries, even though it is the largest Muslim majority country in the world. And so of the 250 million inhabitants in Indonesia, that number probably has changed a bit in the last couple of months. 85% of the 250 million Indonesians are adhering to Islam, okay? What is important, however, and this has very much shaped the perception of Indonesia as an Islamic country, is that the practices of Muslim in Indonesia very often are based on syncretist beliefs. So very often you have Javanese elements that are mixed into belief systems, or if you go to outer island Indonesia, you have traditional adat law that also informs how people practice their faith. And that really has shaped the image that Indonesia had in the world as being different from, let's say, the Middle East or parts of Northern Africa. Okay, so many Indonesians combine Islam with other cultural religious traditions, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly, but it's a very complex mix of different religious traditions. And so for a long time, people have argued it was precisely that kind of syncretist Islam being practiced in Indonesia that actually drove Indonesia's democratization. So a very famous book, a couple of years ago written, 20 years ago now, written by Robert Hefner, a professor at Boston University in the United States, where he basically argued not only is Islam compatible with democracy, but in Indonesia, Islam actually drove democratization, because we had a group of middle-class Indonesians that increasingly also felt that they wanted to have a say in politics. They couched their political agenda in Islamic terms, but eventually drove an opening of Indonesia's political system in 1998 when the Suharto dictatorship collapsed. And so not only, again, is Islam compatible with democracy, but Indonesia shows us that Islam very often actually drives democratization, okay? And so today, Indonesia, again, not many people know this, is the largest Muslim majority democracy in the world. It's the third largest democracy after India and the United States, and it is the largest Muslim majority democracy in the world. And so just by its sheer size, it's actually an important case that we very often probably neglect in our analysis of religious politics in Islamic countries, okay? And so what has been the relationship between the state and Islam as an organized religion in Indonesia? I'm not going to go now through the last 70 years of Indonesian history. I just want to give you a couple of pointers to better understand what the reference point is for the story I want to tell. So Indonesia declared independence from the Dutch in 1945 and basically came up with a constitution that initially had a preamble, 7 words, which are usually referred to as the Jakarta Charter, that basically said everyone in Indonesia who is Muslim needs to adhere to Islamic law. And so if that preamble, if the Jakarta Charter would have been included in the constitution, it would have immediately turned Indonesia into an Islamic state where Islamic law is the basis of state affairs, right? However, during the negotiations in 1945 between Islamic-oriented groups and secular nationalist groups, the secular nationalists eventually won out, and the secular constitution was adopted. So the Jakarta Charter was not included in the constitution. And until today, this is a point of contention in Indonesia between different forces, whether this Jakarta Charter should be put back into the constitution or not. For Indonesia, the largest Muslim majority country in the world, is a country where Islam is not the state religion. It has an ecumenical ideology called Pancasila, which says you need to believe in God, but it doesn't tell you what God that has to be. So therefore, we call it an ecumenical constitution. It's not secular, or it's not an Islamic constitution either. Important then is that we had the New Order military dictatorship that established itself in 1965 in the context of the Cold War, with the support of the United States, with the support of the UK. And basically the New Order dictatorship then was dominated by secular nationalist military men, generals, that basically dominated the bureaucracy and other institutions of Indonesia. And so it was basically a time when political Islam was first sort of driven underground and then increasingly oppressed. So political Islam between 1965 and 1998 in Indonesia did not play much of a role because the secular nationalist dictatorship oppressed it, okay? So you can see how there's a contentious relationship between the state in Indonesia and Islam that really goes back to the colonial period, okay? And so the story really now starts in 1998 when Indonesia's dictatorship collapsed in the context of the Asian financial crisis, you may remember. Suddenly, and these are some headlines I collected over the last couple of years, we've had these kind of stories come out of Indonesia that schoolgirls have to undergo various physical examinations, police, women as well, or women that want to join the police have to undergo similar kind of physical examinations. We had stories like sexual minorities being discriminated against in parts of Indonesia, very often punished through very kind of draconian kind of measures. Stoning laws, for instance, have been introduced in parts of Indonesia officially against sexual minorities. We also have religious minorities being persecuted in Indonesia. I just finished a paper on the Ahmadi in Indonesia, a group of probably around 500,000 people that believe a certain kind of strand of Islam that are being persecuted in Indonesia and prosecuted as well. So not only sexual minorities, but also religious minorities are being persecuted. Women are being discriminated against. We also have a new kind of criminal laws being introduced. A stoning bill has been introduced again in Aceh a couple of years ago as a punishment for various transgressions. We then also have the somewhat comical but not less consequential kind of laws that in certain parts of Indonesia, dating after dark between people that are not married is forbidden, and there's been stories about people being caught that were then married on the spot by the religious police in that part of Indonesia. And then finally, stories also increasingly about how men also are now feeling the impact of these kind of laws. Alcohol has been banned in Indonesia, for instance. Again, certain kind of marriage laws have been introduced over the last couple of years. So there's been a narrative of Indonesia basically seeing a change. So the civil Islam that Indonesia has been so famous for many decades seems to be under threat. So that's the narrative. And so the standard narrative is as follows. There's an Islamization of political and social life in Indonesia after 1998 that manifests itself in these kind of laws that I've just talked about. This is an indication for broader cultural changes in Indonesia. And what we really see is maybe not a sweeping Islamization, but certainly a creeping Shariaization, that we have more and more of these laws being adopted many times at the local level, that basically then at some point create a situation where Indonesia as a country is becoming more conservative. Part of that narrative is also, and this was very, very prominent right after Indonesia became a democracy, when suddenly parties, political parties, were allowed to have religious platforms that was not allowed during the New Order period. Many people argued that Islamist parties are the main driver of this process. So because now, since 1998, we have parties that can have political religious platforms. We have parties that want to have that Jakarta Charter back in the Indonesian constitution. And that's why they push for these kind of morality laws. The story then continues in the way that the secular state opposes these developments. And I don't know if you had the time to read the article that Rebecca shared before his talk from the New York Times, where the narrative very much was also about how we have certain groups push for an Islamization, and the state or people that control the state oppose that. Especially in the late George W. Bush years, beginning of the Obama years as well, after 9/11 and the years after, this was part of a broader narrative about how Indonesia really has become a second front in the war against Islamic terror. So we see a conservative move in Indonesia towards more rigid laws and discrimination of all sorts of groups. Islamist parties are behind this, while the state is secular, as it was during the New Order, and it tries to resist that kind of development. And emblematic of that discussion was this title page of the Far Eastern Economic Review, a great newspaper that unfortunately went out of business a couple of years ago. But as you can see here, the story here is by Sandanan Doom about how the West needs to step up the fight against Islamism in Indonesia. And if you look at the cartoon there, you see Indonesian politicians. At that time, it was Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, whom you see in the center of the stage, a secular politician, Megawati Soekarno Putri on the right, also a secular politician, basically represent Indonesia's political establishment. You have then these two grim-looking military figures that protect that kind of establishment, while under the stage, you see this somewhat Orientalist kind of image of two turban-wearing Islamists that basically try to take it all down, right? And so that was really the story in a picture that people told themselves or each other in the context of these Sharia laws becoming more prominent and more present, okay? Now, when I started to look at this in more detail, there were certain issues that just really did not align with that kind of narrative. And the first one, for instance, is that if you look at the electoral share of Islamist parties, so these are parties that called for the Jakarta Charter being put back into the Indonesian constitution. There's exactly 4 of these: the BPP, the PKS, the PPNUY, and the PPP. At the top, you see the election years, and then you see the vote shares. At the very bottom, you see the total vote shares of Islamist parties. Islamist parties at no point were even close to get a majority of votes in Indonesia. Indonesians do not vote for Islamist parties, even though these parties say, we want to have the Jakarta Charter back on the books, and we want to turn Indonesia into an Islamic state. 20 years later, in 2019, the total vote share of Islamic parties is actually smaller than it was in 1999. One party, the PPNUI, actually went out of business because it does not meet the electoral threshold that parties need to meet to be able to participate in Indonesian elections. So the picture you see here is one of Islamic parties really, really struggling to actually make themselves heard in the political process. You could also say they're irrelevant. So in the largest Muslim majority democracy in the world, Islamic parties do not play a relevant role. Okay, so that's the first kind of puzzle that I came across as I looked at this development more in depth. The second one is that actually these morality laws cluster in Indonesian provinces. So unlike the narratives that say this is something we see spread like wildfire across Indonesia, A, it does not spread very quickly, and B, it actually is confined to exactly 6 provinces. So 90%, or I'll have the numbers on the next slide, 60% of, or 67% of these Islamic laws cluster in exactly 6 areas. We go here from left to right. You see Aceh in northern Sumatra. You then have West Sumatra. You have West Java, East Java, South Kalimantan, and South Sulawesi. That's where most of these laws actually concentrate. So again, another puzzle. It does not align with this narrative of a creeping Shariaization across Indonesia. It's simply not true if you look at the empirics, okay? So some figures here. There's at least now, probably a bit more by now, 753 morality laws that have been adopted in Indonesia. So there's a huge number of these laws that are being adopted. However, and this is interesting in itself, most of these laws are actually adopted at the subnational level. So intolerance, discrimination in Indonesia seems to be a subnational phenomenon. It's not a nationwide push for these kind of laws. There's 1 or 2 laws that have been adopted at the national level, and the other 751 were all adopted very locally in certain districts and certain cities, and only applied to these districts and these cities. And very often you have then cities around where none of these laws are actually present. So they don't really spread either, okay? So as I mentioned before, 67% of these laws then also, not only do they cluster at the subnational level, but they cluster in 6 provinces at the subnational level. So it's a highly confined phenomenon that we find at a certain point of Indonesia's institutional hierarchy in certain kind of localities, okay? And so I then tried to find out or come up with an explanation for why we see these peculiar patterns. And so I then spent some time in these 6 areas, in these 6 clusters. And what I found out also by going through the archives and reading up on the history of these places is that all these 6 areas at some point tried to secede from Indonesia and have a very strong Islamic movement that goes back again to the colonial period called Darul Islam, the House of Islam, or the Abode of Islam. That was an Islamic movement that really tried to establish an Islamic state. When it became clear in 1945 that that won't happen, they pushed for independence unsuccessfully. However, if you look at the networks that were established in 1945 through the Darul Islam rebellion, they survived throughout the New Order years. These networks basically consist of a couple of hundred families that very often intermarry, that basically have a very close-knit community, and they basically transported these ideologies and ideas throughout the New Order, only to resurface then in democratic Indonesia in 1998. And so we have now various groups in Indonesia. Many of them are ephemeral, so they pop up and then disappear after a couple of years. But if you look at the networks behind, most of them are tied to this family of Darul Islam fighters that goes back to the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, okay? So we have groups like Garis, we have groups like Forum Pembela Islam, which has now been banned in Indonesia. And you can see they're actually able to mobilize people on the ground in these areas where they historically have been strong. They also engage in what they call activist politics. They, as you can see there, raid liquor stores. They point out when women don't wear a headscarf that they should be arrested. They go and lobby local district offices and so on and so forth. So there's a strong community of groups that are not represented in the official political party system, but they're situated outside that basically push for a more conservative interpretation of Islam and then push for these kind of laws. So the question now then is, why have these Islamist movements that mobilized at the same time as Islamist parties in Indonesia become so much more successful? Why are they so much more successful in pushing for these kind of laws compared to Islamist parties. And for that, we need to understand that the dynamics for Indonesian elites that occupy the state have changed as well. So the secular nationalist military figures that still occupy Indonesian politics now, for the first time in their career, actually need to go out there and mobilize people. You need to find a way to structure the electorate. You need to find a way to mobilize the electorate. Islamist parties very often can't do that because they do not have structures on the ground. These groups that have been around in these areas for many decades do have the networks and the contacts and the capacity to actually mobilize people on the ground. And so that's why secular politicians now team up with these groups. They help them to mobilize people. In exchange, they then adopt these Sharia laws or these morality laws that I've just mentioned before. So two things here that are very important. It's not Islamic parties that drive this process. And actually, we do not see state capture in Indonesia. Islamist forces have not captured the state. It's still the same elites that basically are dominating the Indonesian state, but they now team up with some of these groups in certain provinces in the context of elections. Okay, so elites that run the state mediate, you could say, the influence of these groups situated in society. And so that's why we see these peculiar patterns, okay? So just to bring that home, that point, and then we can maybe go over to the Q&A. Islamist parties, if you look at this, let's say through a Pierre Bourdieu kind of lens of what kind of capital you need to be successful in politics, Islamist parties are poorly institutionalized. They cannot help candidates to mobilize and structure the electorate. These are enormous kind of challenges. West Java, for instance, has 45 million citizens that can vote. You need to find a way to organize these people. Political parties can't do that. Islamist movements that have had a long historical presence on the ground can actually do that through networks of mosques and boarding schools. Economic capital as well. Indonesian parties are actually cash poor. They do not have any money. They cannot support you in election campaigns. These Islamist movements are actually quite affluent because they have established alcohol monopolies, they run protection rackets. Some of these religious groups that I mentioned before, religious minorities basically pay every month, so they're not getting beaten up. And that money then very often is channeled back into election campaigns. Cultural capital then as well. Islamist movements still have these Islamic credentials that many parties actually have lost ever since they joined Indonesian politics, where corruption is systemic and endemic. And once you are part of formal politics, inevitably you then get caught up in these kind of dynamics. And so because these Islamist movements stay outside the formal political process, they could actually keep up that image of being pious and more credible than Indonesian parties, okay? And so that's why they have to offer a lot more capital, social, economic, and cultural to Indonesian elites that now need to win these elections than parties. And so that's why we see these kind of peculiar dynamics in the adoption of morality laws in Indonesia. So to finish, it's the changing power relations amongst Indonesian elites that basically have forced these elites to reach out and reach down in the political arena. So they need to meet more people and at a lower level to win these elections, since Indonesia has become a democracy. And as they go downward and outward, so to speak, in the political arena, they meet all sorts of groups. And in these 6 clusters, they meet these Islamic groups that are just very, very powerful in these areas. And for their help and support, they basically then adopt these kind of laws. So the main message is that Islamization in Indonesia is basically a result of political expediency. It's not an ideological change that we see so much as groups of elites that take advantage of certain groups on the ground that have thought pretty much the same since 1945, but have also not gained more followers. So these Islamic groups are pretty confined in terms of their membership. It's just very strong in certain kind of localities, and politicians there basically enter alliances to win elections. But by no means does that indicate a broad Shariaization of Indonesia. It's a result of political expediency. And I argue in my book that if these politicians find other ways to actually organize people, they probably abandon these groups pretty quickly, which then means that these laws that we've seen emerge over the last couple of years in Indonesia probably disappear pretty quickly as well. And what also is quite interesting and important is, and I mentioned this before, that the formal political system is not where the story plays out. So Islamist parties, we don't really need to bother with, because most of these dynamics happen completely outside the formal political arena, because these groups that I mentioned before are not institutionalized in that sense. So in terms of what can be done about this, it is not about party reform or good governance measures with regard to Indonesia's official political system, but something needs to be done that takes care of these informal arrangements outside the political arena that we usually look at when we look at Indonesia. So that's, I think, the story I wanted to tell. Thank you for listening.
So thank you for that introduction. I just start off with a few questions, and
Sure.
then people online, feel free to already type your questions in. So you mentioned it, Indonesia is the world's third largest democracy, the largest Muslim majority democracy. According to Freedom House, it's partly free. It has a day ranking, which has a maximum of 100 points. It had 65 in 2017 and went down to 59 this year. Can you tell us a little bit how the state of the democracy is in Indonesia?
Sure. I actually wrote these Freedom House reports for a couple of years, and so very often was somewhat taken aback by the methodology they use. It's very often a perception-based kind of assessment of what happens in Indonesia. And so when we see change from one year to another, it doesn't necessarily mean that the situation on the ground has changed all that much, but maybe people's perception of the situation on the ground has changed all that much. But certainly what we see in Indonesia looks a bit like a democratic regression compared to what we've seen in 1998, when there was so much hope about Indonesia now really becoming a full-fledged democracy, right? So in Indonesia, probably today, we have what we would refer to as a low-quality electoral democracy. So there's regular elections. The elections are actually, in the broadest sense of the word, free and fair. So there's very little election intervention. But of course, socioeconomic realities on the ground, shape the political process. So if you want to run in a local election in a resource-poor district, for instance, which means once you win, there's not that much you can actually get back, you probably need to spend about $5 to $6 million just to launch a credible election campaign, right? And that's in a country where the majority of people still live on less than $1 a day. So you need to have enormous amounts of money to compete in these elections, which of course then means it's only a very narrow group of people that is able to participate in politics as candidates, right? And so that has undermined Indonesia's democracy, for instance, because it's a very narrow, elite, top-heavy kind of democracy in that sense. And then, of course, these laws, even though they are probably the result of political opportunism, have consequences for millions and millions of Indonesians, right? So in West Java, for instance, I mentioned before, there's 45 million people that live there. There's now a headscarf law in that part of Indonesia, which means millions of Indonesian women that do not want to wear a headscarf or are maybe not even Muslim now have to wear a headscarf, right? And so that, again, has diminished maybe the individual rights and freedoms of certain groups in Indonesia. So maybe over time, over the last couple of years, yes, we've seen a regression with regard to the people that participate, with regard to the policies that have been adopted. But ironically, if you look at broader Southeast Asia, it's still one of the more democratic countries because so many other Southeast Asian nations have just become outright dictatorships in the last couple of years. So Indonesia is not perfect as a democracy. Certainly, if you compare it with itself, there's been a transgression or a regression, but the bigger picture is one of Indonesia probably still being at least partly free compared to Thailand or Burma or Cambodia.
Do you see parallels to other Muslim majority democracies?
I think it's still pretty unique in the sense that a lot of, you said Muslim majority democracies?
Yeah, not Southeast Asian, but maybe also.
Sure. I mean, if you compare it to Senegal, for instance, right, you also see that there's a certain group of syncretist kind of citizens that believe or adhere to syncretist beliefs that basically are the bedrock of the democracy in Senegal. And so that's still the case in Indonesia. So as I showed on the map, these conservative trends we see in a really, Indonesia has 38 provinces, right? And in 6 of them do we see these kind of conservative trends, but the rest of Indonesia probably still very much adheres to that kind of civil Islam that I mentioned before. And so I think in Senegal, for instance, you would find similar kind of developments that, yes, there is a certain kind of maybe conservative trend, but it is very localized, it's very confined to certain areas. There's great variance both across space and time. So I think Indonesia really tells a story about movements of that kind in other Muslim majority democracies. Yes.
Do you then see a decentralization, or rather does the government in, I think it's still in Jakarta right now, has anything to say in the provinces, or is most of the laws anyway done locally and affecting people much more than national laws would? Yeah. Again, a trend we see actually worldwide. If you look at intolerance, that's actually a subnational phenomenon in all countries almost around the world where people have looked at. So in the US, for instance, the most discriminatory kind of practices are usually first implemented at the subnational level, and sometimes they then become successful enough to spread nationally. But usually intolerance and discrimination is a local phenomenon. And that's the same in Indonesia. What's interesting about Indonesia is that actually when they designed the decentralization laws in Indonesia, they, for exactly that reason, actually said religion should not be an issue that is decided upon by local governments. It should be a national issue. However, most of these laws are not couched in religious terms, but they're couched in health terms, for instance. So women should not be outside after dark for these and these reasons, right, that have nothing to do with religion. And so there's ways that these local governments have found to get around that stipulation that actually they should not interfere in religious affairs. And once these laws are on the books, again, for institutional reasons I don't want to bore you with, it's very difficult to get rid of them, because in Indonesia, the Supreme Court can revoke these laws, but it's the constitutional court where you need to file your grievances. So if you say, I'm an Indonesian, I find that law violates my constitutional rights, you appeal to the constitutional court, but it's another court, the Supreme Court, that would have to strike down that law. And so there's no communication between these two courts. So at this moment in Indonesia, there's no institutional mechanism to get rid of these laws once they actually have been adopted, even though 90% of them are illegal and against the Indonesian constitution. So I do already have questions online, and one is also going a bit further into that direction. And also, if you have questions, reach out to the microphone that Serena will hand you. So the UN repeatedly expressed concern about the situation of men perceived as gay, most notably in Aceh, which you mentioned is one of the provinces of the 6 cluster regions you mentioned before. Do you have more insights on the current situation of LGBTQ people in Indonesia and why those provinces have those clusters of this law?
Okay. So let me start with the second question first. So these provinces have these conservative trends because, as I tried to show, historically, there have been strong Islamic movements in these areas. So it was these 6 areas that tried to secede from Indonesia in 1945, when it became clear that Indonesia would not adopt the Jakarta Charter, that preamble to the constitution that said everyone who is Muslim needs to adhere to Islamic law. The secular government in Indonesia did not want that, and so that's why then these 6 areas rebelled. And so until today, we have networks of families, essentially, that date back to that rebellion, that fuel and drive that kind of movement. And so that's why we see that localization. Now, with regard to the status of sexual minorities in Indonesia, I think they're discriminated against as much as any other minority that at some point, becomes more vocal and more visible. I mean, we have not only discrimination against sexual minorities, but against religious minorities within Islam as well. So interreligious conflict is actually not all that pronounced in Indonesia anymore. Right now, what we see is intra-religious conflict where Shia, Ahmadi are basically discriminated against by the Muslim Sunni community, right? And so sexual minorities are, I would say, just one of many minorities that are being discriminated against as we speak in Indonesia. And again, quite interestingly, Indonesia has a long history of actually being quite tolerant with regard to sexual minorities. I mean, in Sulawesi, where I lived for about 3 years, there's officially 5 genders. So you have a caste of transsexual priests that for hundreds of years have performed religious rituals for local communities. And now suddenly they're being outlawed. So in many ways, Indonesia now outlaws its own culture, right? And so that's what's in many ways quite disturbing about these trends. But I would not say that sexual minorities are discriminated in any different way or more than other minorities. I mean, we really see a spread in these areas across certain kind of groups that are just weak politically.
One other question online is if, besides those 6 provinces, so there are 32 other provinces,
38. Yeah.
Does the presence of minorities like the Chinese or Indians, does that help against those Islamic movements?
So interestingly, very often, if there's a very clear distribution of minority and majority, then it's usually less of an issue than compared to cases where groups are almost equal in terms of size and presence, right? So in Maluku, for instance, or in Ambon, you have large Muslim groups that are in a Christian majority area. And because of that, we've probably seen conflicts in the early 2000s. But you go to places like Northern Sulawesi, for instance, where the Christian community is so small that you could say, know their place. And therefore, you see less of the kind of conflicts I've talked about, right? But is the presence of religious or ethnic groups sort of a stopgap against these kind of trends? I probably would say no. I mean, we've also seen in many areas minorities react to these kind of laws in their own way. That in certain Christian areas, there's now laws that say church bells should be allowed to ring at any time of the day, because mosques have come up with these kind of laws that they should be allowed to preach at any hour of the day or night, right? And then minorities very often react to that as well with their own laws. So in many places, rather than stopping these kind of developments, it's sort of a race to the top or a race to the bottom, whatever you want to call it. But they very often feed on each other rather than sort of confine each other.
Do we have questions in the room?
Yeah, thank you for this very interesting analysis, and I'm relieved to see that it's only 6 provinces rather than the entire Indonesia. these 6 provinces, the majority are in favor of these laws, or is that just, as you say, it's not quite democracy, just because these groups have the money and they can implement these laws, or do they really have the support of the locals to implement these outdated laws, really?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and also probably a gap in my presentation, because I mainly talked about the adoption of these laws. Now, the implementation is a very different story. As with almost any law in Indonesia, state capacity is so low that they struggle to implement almost any law in Indonesia. So most laws in Indonesia are ignored because the state just doesn't have the apparatus to enforce them. I think 10% of Indonesians pay tax because the government is simply unable to extract tax from Indonesians. And that's after years and years of World Bank programs to actually do something about the tax collection capacity of the Indonesian state. And so that's true with regard to these laws as well. I think most of them are probably not implemented, which is why the joke goes, many people actually support them because they do not feel them really in their daily lives, right? And I mean, again, 2-3 years ago, I was in Aceh province, and the further away I went from the capital, Banda Aceh, the fewer women were actually wearing headscarves in one of the most conservative provinces of Indonesia. And so, again, the joke goes that most Indonesians probably are in favor of these laws because they're not being implemented. However, of course, it also means that these groups I've just talked about very often, out of frustration because they see nothing's happening, take the law in their own hands and then basically go and dish out justice, right? So they then go to these liquor stores and said, here's the law, you're not allowed to sell liquor, now we burn down your liquor store, or they raid karaoke bars, or harass women that are just coming home from work after it's dark, and so on and so forth. So it is felt in certain Indonesians' lives, but by no means are these laws implemented in a sort of widespread kind of fashion. And so if we look at surveys, for instance, many people in Indonesia actually say they're in favor of these kind of laws, probably also because it's very difficult to say you're not, because you're immediately branded as a bad Muslim, right? And Indonesia is still a very religious society of the kind I mentioned before, highly tolerant historically of minorities and mixing syncretist elements with Islam, but it is religion plays an important role, right? And so if you go and ask people, are you against Islamic law? No, of course they're not, right? But in the very same survey, they very often then also say they're actually in favor of democracy, right? And so if you really think this to the end, you cannot be in favor of Islamic law, which basically rejects democracy for that very reason, because you cannot put man-made law above God's law. Indonesians do not seem to find anything strange about the fact that in the same survey they can say they support Islamic law, and then 3 questions later, high figures, 90% of people being surveyed say also they actually support democracy. It's very difficult to find out what's actually really going on. So there's a bit of social desirability bias in these kind of surveys. And for us that basically study this on the ground, I think a lot has to do with the fact that these laws are just basically not felt by the majority of Indonesians. So there's someone in favor of it, but because of the certain way these laws are sort of present.
Thank you very much for your insights. I have a small question regarding the new criminal code that was, I believe, accepted last year and will take effect in 2025, if I'm right. And it's highly, debated, it's highly controversial, and is in that case not a regional question, but of course a national criminal code. What is your assessment? How serious is it, and what does it mean for Indonesian people all around the country?
Sure.
Thank you.
As often with these kind of issues, the devil's probably in the detail, right? So you would have to look at individual stipulations and articles in that law to make an assessment. So what has been reported about greatly in the press was that extramarital sex is now being outlawed, right? But if you then go and look closely, it basically means that only family members can report other family members. So let's say someone goes to Bali and is not married, goes there with his or her partner, there's at no point any risk for foreigners, for instance, but even probably Indonesians that share a hotel room together and are not married, of being arrested, because it would have to be someone from their family that reports them to the police. And so there's all these kind of stipulations and qualifications in the code that I would say, just from having read it superficially, leave me with an image that's probably not as bad as it was portrayed in these headlines. But the bigger issue, I think, is that, as I mentioned before, with any law in Indonesia, it's very unlikely that this is being enforced. And so it's probably going to, we certainly will see headlines of teenagers being arrested and sexual minorities being harassed because of the new criminal code. But does that now affect the 280 million Indonesians in their daily lives? I doubt it. And simply for the fact that almost any other law also does not make itself felt on the ground because the state is just too weak to implement it, right? There's sort of a freedom by mistake, or a decentralization in many ways, also by the absence of capacity, rather than a positive kind of enforcement of certain kind of values through the laws. But I would say that the criminal code is probably not as consequential as people think it is.
But maybe just you talked about headlines. So one, it was rather a small headline, but one headline lately was the U20 football World Cup was supposed to take place in Indonesia later this year, but it was withdrew from the FIFA, the rights to be there, because some government officials and protesters called for the Israeli team to be banned. How influential were those voices? Would you say that was another case of it was made bigger outside of Indonesia than it actually was, or was there actually concern from the FIFA that would be a problem?
So, I mean, football, as in most countries, is hugely popular in Indonesia, especially now that these local mayors and district heads have to stand for election. And so what we've seen over the last couple of years, when I did, studies on public financial management for the World Bank, for instance, in Indonesia, a lot of these local governments have now a budget post that allows them to buy Brazilian football players, for instance, where they then put together their own local team to compete against other local teams, because it's so popular amongst Indonesians. And so I think that move will probably backfire if they really go through with it, because it is such a popular sport. We have elections come up in 2024. My guess is that will just sort of quietly be forgotten at some point. It's also somewhat easy in Indonesia and popular, therefore, to criticize Israel for its politics against Palestine mainly, because it's in many ways quite far away. But Indonesians do not seem to care all that much about Muslim minorities being persecuted in Burma, for instance, right? The Rohingya that fled to Indonesia over the last couple of years are actually not welcomed with open arms, and sort of this being an issue in national politics. So in many ways, I think this was a bit of a gimmick that just now made headlines in the context of the election campaigns that are sort of now, being put into motion with regard to 2024. So I think this is something that will not be very consequential.
Do you think, also because there's a question online, that this affects like the international reputation, and the question here is also like how that, not just maybe we here, but also neighboring countries see the developments on the Islamic movements.
So if you ask, so many people you ask about Indonesia, and where it hurts Indonesia probably most is in its tourism sector, right? If you have these conservative laws, and I think a lot of these headlines were also like, can we still drink alcohol and holiday in Indonesia, even though we're not married? It seems that many people do not know that Bali is actually in Indonesia. And so if Indonesia makes headlines about having these conservative laws, people still go to Bali on holidays because they do not really understand that Bali is an island that belongs to Indonesia, right? So if Indonesia's reputational damage is sort of, blowing up now because of these laws, I'm not really sure if that has an immediate impact on the tourism sector, which again, 90% of people that go to Indonesia actually go to Bali. So I think with regard to its economic impact, it probably doesn't matter all that much. But what I think where it matters is for investors, right, that are increasingly concerned about conflicts or sort of turbulences on the ground that originate in these kind of laws. West Java, for instance, has a huge manufacturing industry. Women are no longer to be allowed outside after 9 o'clock. Many of them work night shift before. They no longer can actually work in the manufacturing and garment industry because of these Sharia laws, because they cannot go home after their shift is over. And so that then becomes a concern for H&M or Nike or whoever produces their T-shirts in West Java, right? And so I think reputational damage probably is, again, very localized because certain international companies have certain kind of local interests and they greatly care about these issues. But the broader kind of image, I think, is not all that harmed because, again, most people that go to Bali do not seem to associate Indonesia with Bali. Yeah, being unfair.
Is there another question? No, is there getting... You have one more.
Did I understand correctly that these laws were introduced because politicians use these Islamic networks in these 6 regions to reach the electorate there?
Yeah.
What happens if these politicians find other ways to reach the electorate? Social media has been around for a while. Is there a shift there going on already, or?
So yeah, as I mentioned, in the last chapter of my book, because I think this is a result of political expediency. I think once politicians become more experienced and find other ways to mobilize and structure the electorate as well, right? How do you reach 45 million people? You can't go and shake hands with everyone. You need to have surrogates that do that for you, right? And once they become more adept at doing that, I think these groups probably become more marginalized. If you go to my website, there's also a paper I wrote with Elizabeth Pisani, who works on Indonesia as well. And we looked at what kind of laws are being adopted at what point in the election cycle in these 6 areas, right? And we see that in Indonesia, they have term limits, so you can only run for 2 terms of 5 years each, right? A bit like in the US or in France. And so outgoing politicians, basically politicians that can no longer run because they're in their 2nd term, adopt fewer of these laws, and they also seem to adopt laws that generate revenue rather than laws that are ideologically inclined. Let's say you pray 5 times a day. You don't make that much money with that, but you do make money with religious taxes, for instance. And so we see a shift in the type and frequency of law that these politicians adopt based on when we look at their activities in the election cycle, which suggests, again, that this is something they do as part of their broader electoral strategy, they also reach out to ethnic groups, they reach out to TV presenters and so on and so forth. And these are just groups that also are in these parts of Indonesia. And so I think if they no longer need them, they probably will then be less inclined to adopt these kind of laws. And so that's why I don't think these talks about a sweeping Shariaization or now this being a sort of a society-wide fundamental change of Indonesian politics are actually justified if we look at these kind of dynamics. Oh.
We have one last question. You mentioned that article that was recently in the New York Times about the Hijrah movement. It's a conservative Islamic movement, which is mostly followed by young Muslim and is highly benefiting from social media.
Yeah.
Do you see there also in the future, first of all, how relevant is social media already for politics, and how will this change maybe in the future politics in Indonesia?
Yeah, it's hugely relevant, but I think it again needs to be understood in a broader kind of context. So in Southeast Asia, we do not really see a democratization of the kind we hoped we would see 20 years ago. So Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand are regressing, and others have state dictatorships. But where we do see a democratization across Southeast Asia is in the way power is organized in ecclesiastical hierarchies. So we see a lot of mega churches establish themselves in the Philippines of the kind we saw in the US, privately run churches that compete against the Catholic Church. We see in Indonesia more and more of these televangelists that basically use social media or TV to reach the masses. Actually, interesting, a lot of these Muslim preachers in Indonesia are advised by religious consultants from the US, who basically trained in the largest religious market of the world, the US, by coming up with strategies for Christian televangelists, and they now sell their services to Indonesian Islamic preachers, right? And so as we see a democratization of religious structures in Indonesia, where we see fewer and fewer kind of institutionalized hierarchies, social media plays an enormous role in reaching people, right? You can directly reach out to, I think your article that you shared mentioned 45 million followers. One preacher has 45. So he communicates with these people directly through social media. So it plays a huge role, but it needs to be understood in the broader kind of development of these kind of traditional ecclesiastical hierarchies collapsing for all sorts of reasons, right? Because people have become more affluent. They now need to find religions or strands of religion that justify why they are rich, right? So the prosperity gospel that we basically saw in the US as well is now something that is hugely popular in Indonesia or the Philippines, because the newly emerging middle class needs to find someone who tells them it's fine to be rich, right? And so that's why we see traditional religious hierarchies basically being substituted by these kind of figures. And so in their strategy, social media play a role. I don't think social media are a cause. They're probably just a medium to transport certain kind of messages that are there because of different kinds of factors. I think that's how I put it.
Thank you so much. We're already running out of time.
Thanks.
If you're here in the room, feel free to stick around, and we have some more sandwiches. And so we are the Asia Society Switzerland. So we always give our guests something from Switzerland, which is chocolate, of course, and something a little bit Asian, which are Szechuan pepper flavored peanuts.
Wow, thank you so much.
So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. That's what I always wanted. Thanks.
Yeah. That's it.
Yeah, thank you.